John 8:14. Respondit Iesus et dixit eis, et si ego testimonium perhibeo de me ipso, ver est testimonium meum, quia sciunde veni et quo vado, vos autem nescitis unde venio aut quo vado. Jesus answered and said to them, even if I bear witness concerning myself, my testimony is true, since I know from where I have come and where I am going. You all, however, do not know from where I come or to where I am going. In addition to some of the idioms that we've seen more recently in recent verses, like testimonium perhibeo and de me ipso, these are phrases it's best not to take too literally, but to translate in accordance with the sense here. We've got one more major thing worth commenting on in this verse, as it seems to me, and that is the form of these verbs, which are in reported questions, indirect questions, after the verb skio, and in the second case, nescitis, respectively. Generally, when you're reporting or relating a question indirectly in Latin, certainly this is the rule for how things worked in the classical period, you need to use a subjunctive mood verb in the subordinate clause, that is the clause that repeats the question. So the direct question in these cases would have been, unde veni, from where have I come, and quo vado, to where am I going? And typically, again, in classical Latin, when you relate such questions indirectly, that is when you're not the one directly asking them, but you're talking about those questions, these verbs would have to shift into the subjunctive mood. They don't in this verse, and in fact, typically, in the Vulgate New Testament, they don't. They stay in the indicative. Now, I'm not sure if there is or is not one single satisfying reason for this. Some people say this is an imitation of the Greek. Other people give different reasons who have looked at this issue. It is certain, however, that in the Old Testament, interestingly, the subjunctive with indirect questions is much more common in the Old Testament of the Vulgate, that is. But when we're in the New Testament, it's seldom seen. For us, in a sense, that makes things easier. If you don't remember, for instance, that the subjunctive has to appear in indirect questions, you're not going to notice it. You're not going to have to worry about it when you read this sentence. It's going to read relatively easily. Now, we will note the two things that Jesus says here. The tense of the verb in the first case changes. In the first case, we have the perfect here, veni, I have come. And in the second case, we have venio, I come, in the present tense. And if we were to add subjunctives in here, as we would have with classical sentences, which might be a good exercise to help you remember both the sequence of tenses and the morphology, we would have to have in that case not veni, but venerim, and not vado, but vadam. And in the second case, not venio, but veniam, present subjunctive again. And in the case of this second vado, again, vadam. Now, in both cases, our lead verb in the main clause, our indicative verb, is in the present tense. So venerim would have to represent time prior in primary sequence or principal sequence. Different grammars talk about this in different ways. And the present subjunctive, as we see in vadam, veniam, and again vadam, would represent contemporaneous time, again in primary sequence after a present tense verb. So if you were to think about the sequence of tenses and how this should work in the subjunctive in classical prose, let's say, that's how you would do it. Now, I'm not saying that the Vulgate is wrong to look like this. It's simply the way that the translator expressed these things in a way that was intelligible to people in his time. I'm just pointing out this is a good excuse for us to review those rules, which do obtain in many other cases outside the Vulgate. So it's a good opportunity for us to review that while we have it. But again, the main thing to note here is what doesn't happen, the fact that subjunctives are not triggered in the case of these subordinate verbs by the presence of indirect questions. That's noticeable, and it tells us something that's unique about the idiom of the Vulgate, and particularly the Vulgate New Testament.